You don't need me to tell you that human civilization is very, very old. Nevertheless, our knowledge of the earliest stages of human civilization were quite limited for many centuries. That is, until the great archaeological discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries, which unearthed for us the great civilizations of the ancient Near East, of which I have drawn a remarkably lifelike map here on the board. Mediterranean. I always start with the Mediterranean Ocean, the Nile River, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. So the great civilizations of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the area we refer to as the Fertile Crescent, of which a little part here about the size of Rhode Island is Canaan, or Canaan. And archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries were stunned to find the ruins and the records of remarkable peoples and cultures, massive, complex empires in some cases, but some of which had completely disappeared from human memory. Their newly uncovered languages had been long forgotten. Their rich literary and legal texts were now undecipherable. That soon changed. But because of those discoveries, we are now in a position to appreciate the monumental achievements of these early civilizations, these earliest civilizations. And so many scholars and many people have remarked that it's not a small irony that the ancient Near Eastern people, with one of the, or perhaps the most lasting legacy, was not a people that built and inhabited one of the great centers of ancient Near Eastern civilization. It can be argued that the ancient Near Eastern people with the most lasting legacy is a people that had an idea. It was a new idea that broke with the ideas of its neighbors. And those people were the Israelites. And scholars have come to the realization that despite the Bible's pretensions to the contrary, the Israelites were a small, and I've actually overrepresented it here, I'm sure it should be much smaller, a small and relatively insignificant group for much of their history. They did manage to establish a kingdom in the land that was known in antiquity as Canaan. Around the year 1000, they probably succeeded in subduing some of their neighbors, collecting tribute. There's some controversy about that. But in about 922, this kingdom divided into two smaller and lesser kingdoms that fell in importance. The northern kingdom, which consisted of 10 of the 12 Israelite tribes, and known confusingly as Israel, was destroyed in 722 by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom, which consisted of 2 of the 12 tribes, and known as Judah, managed to survive until the year 586, when the Babylonians came in and conquered and sent the people into exile. Capital Jerusalem fell. Conquest and exile were events that normally would spell the end of a particular ethnic national group, particularly in antiquity. Conquered peoples would trade their defeated God for the victorious God of their conquerors, and eventually there would be cultural and religious assimilation, intermarriage, that people would disappear as a distinctive entity. And in fact, that is what happened to the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom to a large degree. They were lost to history. This did not happen to those members of the nation of Israel who lived in the southern kingdom, Judah. Despite the demise of their national political base in 586, the Israelites alone, really, among the many peoples who have figured in ancient Near Eastern history, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Phoenicians, the Hurrians, the Canaanites, they emerged after the death of their state, producing a community and a culture that can be traced through various twists and turns and vicissitudes of history right down into the modern period. That's a pretty unique claim. And they carried with them the idea and the traditions that laid the foundation for the major religions of the Western world: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So what is this radical new idea that shaped a culture and enabled its survival into later antiquity and really right into the present day in some form? Well, the conception of the universe that was widespread among ancient peoples is one that you're probably familiar with. People regarded the various natural forces as imbued with divine power, as in some sense divinities themselves. The earth was a divinity, the sky was a divinity, the water was a divinity, had divine power. In other words, the gods were identical with or immanent in the forces of nature. There were many gods, no one single god was therefore all-powerful. There is very, very good evidence to suggest that ancient Israelites by and large, shared this worldview. They participated at the very earliest stages in the wider religious and cultic culture of the ancient Near East. However, over the course of time, some ancient Israelites, not all at once and not unanimously, broke with this view and articulated a different view, that there was one divine power, one God, but much more important than number was the fact that this God was outside of and above nature. This God was not identified with nature. He transcended nature. And he wasn't known through nature or natural phenomena. He was known through history, events, and a particular relationship with humankind. And that idea, which seems simple at first and not so very revolutionary, we will see that's an idea that affected every aspect of Israelite culture, and in ways that will become clear as we move through the course and learn more about biblical religion and biblical views of history. It was an idea that ensured the survival of the ancient Israelites as an entity, as an ethnic religious entity. In various complicated ways, the view of an utterly transcendent God with absolute control over history made it possible for some Israelites to interpret even the most tragic and catastrophic events, such as the destruction of their capital and the exile of their remaining peoples, not as a defeat of Israel's God, or even God's rejection of them, but as a necessary part of God's larger purpose or plan for Israel. These Israelites left for us the record of their religious and cultural revolution in the writings that are known as the Hebrew Bible, collectively. And this course is an introduction to the Hebrew Bible as an expression of the religious life and thought of ancient Israel and as a foundational document of Western civilization. The course has several goals. First and foremost, we want to familiarize you with the contents of the Hebrew Bible. We're not going to read every bit of it word for word. We will read certain chunks of it quite carefully, and others we will choose selections, but you will get a very good sense and a good sampling of the contents of the Bible. A second goal is to introduce you to a number of approaches to the study of the Bible, different methodological approaches that have been advanced by modern scholars, but some of which are in fact quite old. At times, we will play the historian. At times, we will be literary critics. How does this work as literature? At times, we will be religious and cultural critics. What is it the Israelites were saying in their day and in their time, and against who and for what? A third goal of the course is to provide some insight into the history of interpretation. This is a really fun part of the course. The Bible's radically new conception of the divine, its revolutionary depiction of the human being as a moral agent, its riveting saga of the nation of Israel, their story, has drawn generations of readers to ponder its meaning and message. And as a result, the Bible has become the base of an enormous edifice of interpretation and commentary and debate, both in traditional settings, but also in academic, university, secular settings. And from time to time, particularly in section discussion, you will have occasion to consider the ways in which certain biblical passages have been interpreted, sometimes in very contradictory ways, over the centuries. That can be a really fun and exciting part of the course. A fourth goal of the course is to familiarize you with the culture of ancient Israel as represented in the Bible against the backdrop of its ancient Near Eastern setting, its historical and cultural setting. Because the archaeological discoveries that are referred to in the ancient Near East revealed to us the spiritual and cultural heritage of all of the inhabitants of the region, including the Israelites. And one of the major consequences of these finds is the light that they have shed on the background and the origin of the materials in the Bible. So we now see that the traditions in the Bible did not come out of a vacuum. The early chapters of Genesis 1 through 11, they're known as the primeval history, which is a very unfortunate name because these chapters really are not best read or understood as history in the conventional sense. But these 11 chapters owe a great deal to ancient Near Eastern mythology. The creation story in Genesis 1 draws upon the Babylonian epic known as Enuma Elish. We'll be talking about that text in some depth. The story of the first human pair in the Garden of Eden, which is in Genesis 2 and 3, has clear affinities with the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's a Babylonian and Assyrian epic in which a hero embarks on this exhausting search for immortality. The story of Noah and the flood, which occurs in Genesis 6 through 9, is simply an Israelite version of an older flood story that we have found copies of, a Mesopotamian story called the Epic of Atrahasis, a flood story that we also have incorporated in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Biblical traditions have roots that stretch deep into earlier times and out into surrounding lands and traditions. And the parallels between the biblical stories and ancient Near Eastern stories that they parallel has been the subject of intense study. However, it isn't just the similarity between the biblical materials and the ancient Near Eastern sources that is important to us. In fact, in some ways, it's the dissimilarity that is remarkably important to us. The biblical transformation of a common Near Eastern heritage in light of its radically new conceptions of God and the world and humankind. We'll be dealing with this in some depth, but I'll give you one quick example. We have a Sumerian story from about the 3rd millennium BCE, right? Going back 3,000 BCE. It's the story of Ziusudra, and it's very similar to the Genesis flood story of Noah. In both of these stories, the Sumerian and the Israelite story, you have a flood that is the result of a deliberate divine decision. One individual is chosen to be rescued. That individual is given very specific instructions on building a boat. He's given instructions about who to bring on board. The flood comes and exterminates all living things. The boat comes to rest on a mountaintop. The hero sends out birds to reconnoiter the land. When he comes out of the ark, he offers a sacrifice to the god. The same narrative elements are in these two stories. It's just wonderful when you read them side by side. So what is of great significance, though, is not simply that the biblical writer is retelling a story that was clearly went around, everywhere in the ancient Mesopotamia. They were transforming the story so that it became a vehicle for the expression of their own values and their own views. In the Mesopotamian stories, for example, the gods act capriciously. The gods act on a whim. In fact, in one of the stories, the gods say, "Oh, people, they're so noisy, I can't sleep. Let's wipe them all out." Right? That's the rationale. There's no moral scruple. They destroy these helpless but stoic humans who are chafing under their tyrannical and unjust and uncaring rule. In the biblical story, when the Israelites told the story, they modified it. It's God's uncompromising ethical standards that lead him to bring the flood in an act of divine justice. He's punishing the evil corruption of human beings that he has so lovingly created and whose degradation he can't bear to witness. So it's saying something different. It's providing a very different message. So when we compare the Bible with the literature of the ancient Near East, we'll see not only the incredible cultural and literary heritage that was obviously common to them, but we'll see the ideological gulf that separated them, and we'll see how biblical writers so beautifully and cleverly manipulated and used these stories, as I said, as a vehicle for the expression of a radically new idea. They drew upon these sources, but they blended and shaped them in a particular way. And that brings us to a critical problem facing anyone who seeks to reconstruct ancient Israelite religion or culture on the basis of the biblical materials. That problem is the conflicting perspective between the final editors of the text and some of the older sources that are incorporated into the Bible, some of the older sources that they were obviously drawing on. Those who were responsible for the final editing, the final forms of the texts, had a decidedly monotheistic perspective, ethical monotheistic perspective. And they attempted to impose that perspective on their older source materials. And for the most part, they were successful, but at times the result of their effort is a deeply conflicted, deeply ambiguous text. And again, that's going to be one of the most fun things for you as readers of this text, if you're alert to it, if you're ready to listen to the cacophony of voices that are within the text. In many respects, the Bible represents or expresses a basic discontent with the larger cultural milieu in which it was produced. And that's interesting for us because a lot of modern people have a tendency to think of the Bible as an emblem of conservatism, right? We tend to think of this as an old fuddy-duddy document. It's outdated, has outdated ideas. And I think the challenge of this course is that you read the Bible with fresh eyes so that you can appreciate it for what it was, and in many ways what it continues to be, a revolutionary cultural critique. We can read the Bible with fresh and appreciative eyes only if we first acknowledge and set aside some of our presuppositions about the Bible. It's really impossible, in fact, that you not have some opinions about this work, because it's an intimate part of our culture. So even if you've never opened it or read it yourselves, I bet you can cite me a line or two, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and I bet you don't really know what it means. The poor will always be with you. I'm sure you don't really know what that means. These are things and phrases that we hear, and they create within us a certain impression of the biblical text and how it functions. Verses are quoted, they're alluded to, whether to be championed and valorized or whether to be lampooned and pilloried, but we can feel that we have a rough idea of the Bible and a rough idea of its outlook, when in fact what we really have are popular misconceptions that come from the way in which the Bible's been used or misused. Most of our cherished presuppositions about the Bible are based on astonishing claims that others have made on behalf of the Bible, claims that the Bible has not made on behalf of itself. So before we proceed, I need to ask you to set aside, for the purposes of this course, some of the more common myths about the Bible. I have a little list here for you. Today what I'd like to do is begin our survey of Genesis 1 through 11 in order to illustrate the way that biblical writers, and precisely who we think they were and when they lived is something we'll talk about later, but the way biblical writers drew upon the cultural and religious legacy of the ancient Near East that we've been talking about, its stories and its imagery, even as they transformed it in order to conform to a new vision of a non-mythological God. We're going to be looking at some of Kaufman's ideas as we read some of these texts. Now, one of the scholars who's written quite extensively and eloquently on the adaptation of ancient Near Eastern motifs in biblical literature, come on, and you can come, is a scholar by the name of Nahum Sarna. I highly recommend his book. It appears on your optional reading list. And I'll be drawing very heavily on Sarna's work as well as the work of some other scholars who have spent a great deal of time comparing Israelite and ancient Near Eastern stories, particularly these opening chapters, in order to see the features that they share and to wonder if perhaps there isn't, after all, a chasm that divides them quite deeply. In our consideration of Genesis 1 and 2, we first need to consider a Babylonian epic, an epic that is known by its opening words, at the top of the column over there, Enuma Elish, which means when on high, the opening words of this epic. And the epic opens before the formation of heaven and earth. Nothing existed except water. And water existed in two forms. There's the primeval freshwater ocean, which is identified with a male divine principle, a male god, Apsu. You have a primeval saltwater ocean, which is identified with a female divine principle, Tiamat. Tiamat appears as this watery ocean, but also as a very fierce dragon-like monster. I will be reading sections from Spizer's translation of Enuma Elish, part of the anthology put together by Pritchard. It begins, when on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, naught but primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Mumu Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. No reed hut had been matted, no marshland had appeared, when no gods whatever had been brought into being, uncalled by name, their destinies undetermined. Then it was that the gods were formed within them. So there's some sort of commingling or union of this male and female divine, these male and female divine principles, a sexual union of Apsu and Tiamat that begins a process of generation. And it produces first demons and monsters. Eventually, gods will begin to emerge. Now, in time, Tiamat and Apsu are disturbed by the din and the tumult of these younger gods. The divine brothers banded together. They disturbed Tiamat as they surged back and forth. Yea, they troubled the mood of Tiamat by their hilarity in the abode of heaven. Apsu, opening his mouth, said unto resplendent Tiamat, Their ways are verily loathsome unto me. By day I find no relief, nor repose by night. I will destroy, I will wreck their ways, that quiet may be restored. Let us have rest. Then answered Mumu Tiamat, giving counsel to Apsu. Ill-wishing and ungracious was Mumu's advice. Do destroy, my father, the mutinous ways. Then shalt thou have relief by day and rest by night. When Apsu heard this, his face grew radiant because of the evil he planned against the gods, his sons. So he decides to destroy the gods. And he is thwarted by a water god named Ea, an earth water god, sorry, he's a combination, earth water god named Ea. And Apsu is killed. Tiamat now is enraged, and she's bent on revenge. She makes plans to attack all of the gods with her assembled forces. The gods are terrified, and they need a leader to lead them against her army. And they turn to Marduk. Marduk agrees to lead them in battle against Tiamat and her assembled forces. Her forces are under the, I guess, generalship of Kingu. And he agrees to lead them against Tiamat and Kingu on condition that he be granted sovereignty, right? And he sets terms. His heart exulting, he said, Creator of the gods, destiny of the great gods, if indeed I, as your avenger, am to vanquish Tiamat and save your lives, and set up the assembly, proclaim supreme my destiny. Let my word, instead of you, determine the fates. Unalterable shall be what I may bring into being. Neither recalled nor changed shall be the command of my lips. And the agreement is struck. And Marduk fells Tiamat in battle. It's a fierce battle, and there is, in fact, a memorable passage that details her demise. In fury, Tiamat cried out aloud. To the roots her legs shook both together. And then joined issue Tiamat and Marduk. They strove in single combat, locked in battle. The Lord Marduk spread out his net to enfold her. The evil wind which followed behind he let loose in her face. When Tiamat opened her mouth to consume him, he drove in the evil wind, that she closed not her lips. And as the fierce winds charged her belly, her body was distended and her mouth was wide open. He released the arrow. It tore her belly. It cut through her inside, splitting the heart. Having thus subdued her, he extinguished her life. He cast down her carcass to stand upon it. Well, what do you do with the carcass of a ferocious monster? You build a world. And that's what Marduk did. He takes the carcass, he slices it into two halves, rather like a clamshell. And out of the top half, he creates the firmament, the heaven. With the other half, he creates the land, the earth. He split her like a shellfish into two parts. Half of her he set up and sealed as a sky, pulled down the bar, and posted guards. He bade them to allow not her waters to escape. Right? So he has used her body to press back her waters, and that's what the sealing is, the firmament, a firm sheet or structure that's holding back waters. When little holes come along, that's rain coming through. And the bottom part is the land, which is pressing down waters below. They come up every now and then in springs and rivers and seas and lakes and things. That is the created world. But he doesn't stop there, and he creates various heavenly bodies at this point. He constructed stations for the great gods. The heavenly bodies are understood as stations for the great gods, fixing their astral likenesses as constellations. He determined the year by designating the zones. He set up 3 constellations for each of the 12 months. The moon he caused to shine, the night to him and trusting. And then the complaints begin to roll in. The gods are very unhappy because they have now been assigned specific duties in the maintenance of the cosmos. You know, the moon god has to come up at night and hang around for a while and go back down, and the sun has to trundle across the sky. And they're pretty unhappy about this, and they want relief from working and laboring at their assigned stations. And so Marduk accedes to this demand. He takes blood from the slain general Kingu, the leader of Tiamat's army, the rebels, and he fashions a human being, with the express purpose of freeing the gods from menial labor. Blood I will mass and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Verily, savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease. It was Kingu who contrived the uprising and made Tiamat rebel and joined battle. So they bound him, holding him before Ea, and out of Kingu's blood they fashioned mankind, and Ea imposed the service and let free the gods. So the grateful gods now recognize the sovereignty of Marduk, and they build him a magnificent shrine or temple in Babylon, pronounced Bab-el, which simply means gateway of the god, the gate of the god. Babylon means the city that is the gateway of the god. And a big banquet follows, and Marduk is praised for all that he's accomplished, and his kingship is confirmed. And Enuma Elish ends. It was the great national epic of the city of Babel, or Babylon. It was recited during the New Year festival, which was the most important festival on the cultic calendar. And Nahum Sarna points out that it had 4 main functions, which I've listed over here. The first of those functions is theogonic. It tells us a story of the birth of the gods, where they came from. Its second function is cosmological. It's explaining cosmic phenomena, the land, the sky, the heavenly bodies, and so on, and their origins. It also serves a social and political function, because the portrait or picture of the universe or the world and its structure corresponds to and legitimates the structure of Babylonian society. The position and the function of the humans in the scheme of creation corresponds or parallels precisely the position of slaves in Mesopotamian society. The position and function of Marduk at the top of the hierarchy of authority parallels and legitimates the Babylonian king, and with others arranged within this pyramid that falls below. The epic also explains and mirrors the rise of Babel as one of the great cities in the ancient Near East. It explains its rise to power and Marduk's rise from being a city god to being at the head of the pantheon of a large empire. This also had a cultic function as well. According to Sarna and some other scholars, the conflict, that battle scene between Tiamat and Marduk, which is described at some length, symbolizes the conflict or the battle between the forces of chaos and the forces of cosmos or cosmic order. And that's a perpetual conflict. Each year it's dramatized by the cycle of the seasons. And at a certain time of the year it seems that the forces of darkness and chaos are prevailing, but each spring, once again, cosmic order and life return. So the epic served as a kind of script for the reenactment of the primeval battle in a cultic or temple setting. And that reenactment helped to ensure the victory of the forces of cosmos and life each year over the forces of chaos and death. So if we recall now some of the things we were talking about last time in the theories of Kaufman, we might describe the worldview that's expressed by Enuma Elish in the following way, and this is certainly what Sarna does. We're going to consider, first of all, the view of the gods, the view of humans, and the view of the world, right? 3 distinct categories. First of all, the gods. The gods are clearly limited, right? A god can make a plan and they're thwarted by another god who then murders that god. They are amoral. Some of them are nicer and better than others, but they're not necessarily morally good or righteous. They emerge from this indifferent primal realm, this mixture of salt and sea waters that is the source of all being and the source of ultimate power, but they age and they mature and they fight and they die. They're not wholly good, not wholly evil, and no one God's will is absolute. The portrait of humans that emerges is that humans are unimportant menials. They are the slaves of the gods. The gods have little reciprocal interest in or concern for them, and they create human beings to do the work of running the world. To some degree, they look upon them as slaves or pawns. The picture of the world that would seem to emerge from this story is that it is a morally neutral place. That means that for humans, it can be a difficult and hostile place. The best bet, perhaps, is to serve the god of the day, whatever god might be ascendant, to earn his favor and perhaps his protection. But even that god will have limited powers and abilities and may, in fact, be defeated or may turn on his devotees. Now, if we turn to the creation story, the first of the 2 creation stories that are in the Bible, because in fact there are 2 creation stories with quite a few contradictions between them. But if we turn to the first creation story in Genesis 1, it concludes in Genesis 2, verse 4. And not for nothing, but everyone understands the function of the colon, right? So if we say Genesis 1:1, I mean chapter 1, verse 1. And then it goes to Genesis 2, chapter 2, verse 4. Left side of the colon is chapter, right side of the colon is verse, and every sentence has a verse number in the Bible, approximately sentence. If we look now, we'll see a different picture emerging. The biblical God in this story, which I hope you have read, is presented as being supreme and unlimited. That's connected with the lack of mythology in Genesis 1, or rather the suppression of mythology. Okay, there's a distinction between the two, and we'll have to talk about that, and hope that you'll get into some of that in section as well. I'm using the term mythology now the way we used it in the last lecture when we were talking about Kaufman's work. Mythology is used to describe stories that deal with the birth, the life events of gods and demigods, sometimes legendary heroes, but narrating a sequence of events. The biblical creation account is non-mythological because there is no biography of God in here. God simply is. There's no theogony, no account of his birth. There's no story by means of which he emerges from some other realm. In the Mesopotamian account, the gods themselves are created, and they're not even created first, actually. The first generation of beings creates these odd demons and monsters, and gods only are created after several generations, and the god of creation, Marduk, is actually kind of a latecomer in the picture. And this is also a good time for us to draw a distinction between mythology and myth. Kaufman and others have claimed that mythology is not in certainly this biblical story, or if it's not there, it's at least suppressed. But in contrast, myth is not mythology. Myth is a term we use to refer to a traditional story. It's often fanciful. It relates imaginatively events which it claims happen in historical time, not in a primordial realm before time. And a myth is designed to explain some kind of practice or ritual or custom or natural phenomenon. And that is why to this day, I don't know, give me some myth that we all know of, Paul Bunyan's axe or handle is something in American nature, which I now no longer remember. But myths are fanciful, imaginative tales that are trying to explain the existence of either a thing or a practice or even a belief. Sometimes it's a story that's a veiled explanation of a truth. We think of parables, perhaps, or allegories. And so the claim that's often made is that the Bible doesn't have full-blown mythology. It doesn't focus on stories about the lives and deaths and interactions of gods. But it does certainly contain myths. It has traditional stories and legends, some quite fanciful, whose goal it is to explain how and why something is what it is. So returning to Genesis 1, we have an absence of theogony and mythology in the sense of a biography of God in this opening chapter, and that means the absence of a meta-divine realm. If you remember nothing else from this course, and certainly for the midterm exam, you should remember the words meta-divine realm. There's a little hint for you there. Okay, it's an important concept. You don't have to buy into it, you just have to know it, okay? But there is an absence of what Kaufman would call this meta-divine realm, this primordial realm from which the gods emerge. We also, therefore, have no sense that God is immanent in nature or tied to natural substances or phenomena. So the biblical God's powers and knowledge do not appear to be limited by the prior existence of any other substance or power. Nature also is not divine. It's demythologized, de-divinized, if that's a word. The created world is not divine. It is not the physical manifestation of various deities, an earth god, a water god, and so on. The line of demarcation, therefore, between the divine and the natural and human worlds would appear to be clear. So, to summarize, in Genesis 1, the view of God is that there is one supreme God who is creator and sovereign of the world, who simply exists, who appears to be incorporeal, and who and for whom the realm of nature is separate and subservient. He has no life story, no mythology, and his will is absolute. Indeed, creation takes place through the simple expression of his will. When God began to create heaven and earth, then there's a parenthetical clause, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. He expressed his will that there be light, and there was light. And that's very different from many ancient Near Eastern cosmogonies in which there's always a sexual principle at work in creation. Creation is always the result of procreation in some way, male and female principles combining. There's a very similar Egyptian creation story, actually, in which the god Ptah just wills, "Let this be." It reads very much like Genesis 1, and yet even so there's still a sexual act that follows the expression of those wills. So it is still different. Consider now the portrait of humankind, that emerges from the biblical creation story in contrast to Enuma Elish. In Genesis, humans are important. Genesis 1, humans are important. And in fact, the biblical view of humans really emerges from both of the creation stories when they're read together. The story here in Genesis 1, and then the creation story that occupies much of 2 and 3. The two accounts are extremely different, but they both signal the unique position and dignity of the human being. In the first account, in Genesis 1, the creation of the human is clearly the climactic divine act. After this, God can rest. And a sign of the human's importance is the fact that humans are said to be created in the image of God. Right? This occurs in Genesis 1, verse 26. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. What might that mean? Looking at the continuation of the verse of the passage, we have some idea, because humans, we see, are going to be charged with specific duties towards and rights over the created world. And it seems, therefore, that the idea of being created in the image of God is connected with those special rights and duties. A creature is required who is distinguished in certain ways from other animals. How are humans distinguished from other animals? You could make a long list, but it might include things like the capacity for language and higher thought or abstract thought, conscience, self-control, free will. So if those are the distinctive characteristics that earn the human being certain rights over creation, but also give them duties towards creation, and the human is distinct from animals and being created in the image of God, now, there's perhaps a connection. To be godlike is to perhaps possess some of these characteristics. Now, being created in the image of God carries a further implication. It implies that human life is somehow sacred and deserving of special care and protection. And that's why in Genesis 9, verse 6, we read, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, in exchange for that man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God was man created." We invoke that rationale from Genesis 1 in the absolute prohibition on murder. There is no way to compensate or punish someone for murder. It simply means forfeiture of one's own life. That's how sacred human life is. That's the biblical view. So the concept of the divine image in humans, right, that's a powerful idea. There is a divine image in humans, and that breaks with other ancient conceptions of the human. In Genesis 1, humans are not the menials of God. And in fact, Genesis expresses the antithesis of this, where in Enuma Elish, service was imposed upon the humans, so the gods were free. They didn't have to worry about anything. The humans would take care of gods. We have the reverse. It's almost like a polemical inversion in Genesis 1. The very first communication of God to the human that's created is concern for that creature's physical needs and welfare. He says in Genesis 1, verses 28 and 29, he blesses them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fertile and increase. Fill the earth, master it, rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth." In Genesis 2, verse 16, after the creation story there, "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden you are free to eat." His first thought is, what are you going to eat? I want you to be fruitful and multiply, and so on. So humans in Genesis are not presented as the helpless victims of blind forces of nature. They're not the menials and servants of capricious gods. They are creatures of majesty and dignity, and they are of importance too, objects of concern for the God who has created them. At the same time, and I think very much in line with the assertion that humans are created in the image of God, humans are not, in fact, gods. They are still creatures in the sense of created things, and they are dependent on a higher power. So in the second creation story, beginning in Genesis 2:4, we read that the first human is formed when God fashions it from the dust of the earth, or clay. There are lots of ancient Near Eastern stories of gods fashioning humans from clay. We have depictions of gods as potters at a potter's wheel, just turning out lots of little humans. But the biblical account, as much as it borrows from that motif, again takes pains to distinguish and elevate the human. First, the fashioning of the human from clay is, again, in that story, it's the climactic, or, well, not quite climactic. It's the penultimate, I suppose, moment in the story. The final climactic act of creation is the creation of the female from the male. That is actually the peak of creation, what can I say? Second and significantly, not an afterthought, it's the peak of creation. Second and significantly, God himself blows the breath of life into Adam's nostrils. So while he fashions this clay figure, all right, this carcass actually, and then breathes life, his own life, into it. So in the second creation story, just as in the first, there's a sacred imprint of some kind that distinguishes the human creation from the other creatures. So this idea that the human being is a mixture of clay, he's molded from clay but enlivened by the breath of God, it captures that paradoxical mix of sort of earthly and divine elements, dependence and freedom, that marks the human as unique. It should further be noted that in the first creation account, there's no implication that man and woman are in any kind of unequal relationship before God. The Hebrew word that designates the creature created by God is the word Adam. It's actually not a proper name. Small a. It is Adam. It's a generic term. It simply means human, or more precisely, earthling, because it comes from the word Adamah, which means ground or earth. So this is an Adam, an earthling, a thing that has been taken from the earth. Genesis 1 states that God created the Adam with a definite article. This is not a proper name. God created the Adam, the earthling. Male and female created he them. That's a line that's vexed commentators for centuries and has spawned many very fascinating interpretations. And you will be reading some of those in the readings that are assigned for section discussion next week, and I think having a great deal of fun with them. Moreover, this earthling that seems to include both male and female is then said to be in the image of God. So that suggests that the ancient Israelites didn't conceive of God as gendered or necessarily gendered. The Adam, the earthling, male and female, was made in the image of God. Even in the second creation account, it's not clear that the woman is subordinate to the man. Many medieval Jewish commentators enjoy pointing out that she was not made from his head so that she not rule over him, but she wasn't made from his foot so that she would be subservient to him. She was made from his side so that she would be a companion to him. And the creation of woman, as I said, is in fact the climactic creative act in the second Genesis account. With her formation, creation is now complete. So the biblical creation stories individually and jointly present a portrait of the human as the pinnacle and purpose of creation. Godlike in some way, in possession of distinctive faculties and characteristics that equip them for stewardship over the world that God has created. Finally, let's talk about the image of the world that emerges from the creation story in Genesis 1. In these stories, there is a very strong emphasis on the essential goodness of the world. Recall some of Kaufman's ideas or categories again. One of the things he claims is that in a polytheistic system, which is morally neutral, where you have some primordial realm that spawns demons, monsters, gods, evil is a permanent necessity. It's just built into the structure of the cosmos. Because of the fact that all kinds of divine beings, good and bad, are generated and locked in conflict. So the world isn't essentially good in its nature or essentially bad. Note the difference in Genesis. After each act of creation, what does God say? It is good, right? Genesis 1, verse 4, verse 10, verse 12, verse 18, verse 21, verse 25. And after the creation of living things, the text states that God found all that he made to be very good. So there are 7 occurrences of the word good in Genesis. That's something you want to watch for. If you're reading a passage of the Bible and you're noticing a word coming up a lot, count them. There's probably going to be 7 or 10. They love doing that. The 7-fold or the 10-fold repetition of a word, such a word is called a Leitwort. A recurring word that becomes thematic. That's a favorite literary technique of the biblical author. So we read Genesis 1 and we hear this recurring, and it was good, and he looked and it was good, and he looked and it was good. And we have this tremendous rush of optimism. The world is good. Humans are important. They have purpose and dignity. The biblical writer is rejecting the concept of a primordial evil, a concept found in the literature of the ancient Near East. So for the biblical writer of this story, it would seem that evil is not a metaphysical reality built into the structure of the universe. So all signs of a cosmic battle or some primordial act of violence between the forces of chaos and evil and the forces of cosmos and good are eliminated. In a Pneuma Elish, cosmic order is achieved only after a violent struggle with very hostile forces. But in Genesis, creation is not the result of a struggle between divine antagonists. God imposes order on the demythologized elements that he finds. Water, but it's just water. Right? Let's look a little bit more closely at Genesis 1 to make this case. The chapter begins with a temporal clause, which is unfortunately often translated in the beginning, which implies that what follows is going to give you an ultimate account of the origins of the universe. You sort of expect something like, in the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. Like this was the first thing to happen in time, right? So that translation causes people to believe that the story is giving me an account of the first event in time, forward. But it's actually a bad translation. The Hebrew phrase that starts the book of Genesis is pretty much exactly like the phrase that starts Enuma Elish. When on high, there was a whole bunch of water and stuff, then suddenly this happened. Very similar in the Hebrew. It's better translated this way. When God began creating the heavens and the earth, he said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And that translation suggests that the story isn't concerned to depict the ultimate origins of the universe. It's interested in explaining how and why the world got the way it is. When God began this process of creating the heaven and the earth was unformed and void, and his wind was on the surface of the deep and so on, he said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So we find that, in fact, something exists. It has no shape. So creation in Genesis 1 is not described as a process of making something out of nothing. That's a notion referred to as creation ex nihilo, creation of something out of utter nothing. It's instead a process of organizing pre-existing materials and imposing order on those chaotic materials. So we begin with this chaotic mass, and then there's the ruach of God. Now sometimes this word ruach is kind of anachronistically translated as spirit. It really doesn't mean that in the Hebrew Bible. In later levels of Hebrew, it will start to mean that. But it is really wind. Ruach is wind. So when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, the wind of God sweeping over the deep. Remember the cosmic battle between Marduk and Tiamat. Marduk, the storm god, who released his wind against Tiamat, the primeval deep, the primeval water, representing the forces of chaos. And you should immediately hear the great similarities. Our story opens with a temporal clause, when on high, when God began creating. We have a wind that sweeps over chaotic waters, just like the wind of Marduk released into the face of Tiamat. And the Hebrew term is particularly fascinating. In fact, the text says, "And there is darkness on the face of deep." No definite article. The word deep is a proper name, perhaps. The Hebrew word is tahom, means deep. And etymologically, it's exactly the same word as tiamat. The at ending is just feminine. So tiam, tahom. It's the same word. It's a related word. So the wind over the face of deep. Now this demythologized. So it's as if they're invoking the story that would have been familiar and yet changing it. So the storyteller has actually set the stage for retelling the cosmic battle story that everyone knew. That was a story that surely was near and dear to the hearts of many ancient Israelites and ancient Near Eastern listeners. So all the elements are there for the retelling of that story. We've got wind, we've got a primeval, chaotic, watery mass or deep, and then, surprise, there's no battle. There's just a word. Let there be light. And the ancient Near Eastern listener would prick up their ears. Where's the battle? Where's the violence? Where's the gore? I thought I knew this story. So something new, something different was being communicated in this story. And don't think that biblical writers didn't know this motif of creation following upon a huge cosmic battle, particularly a battle with a watery dragon-like monster. There are many poetic passages in poetic sections of the Bible that contain very clear and explicit allusions to that myth. It was certainly known and told to Israelite children and part of the culture. We have it mentioned in Job. We have it mentioned in the following psalm, Psalm 74, verses 12 to 17. "O God, my king from of old, who brings deliverance throughout the land, it was you who drove back the sea with your might, who smashed the heads of the monsters in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan, a sea monster. Other Psalms also contain similar lines. Isaiah 51, verses 9 through 10. It was you that hacked Rahab, this is another name of a primeval water monster, in pieces. It was you that pierced the dragon. It was you that dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep. These were familiar stories. They were known in Israel. They were recounted in Israel. They were stories of a God who violently slays the forces of chaos, represented as watery dragons, as a prelude to creation. And the rejection of this motif or this idea in Genesis 1 is pointed and purposeful. It's demythologization. Its removal of the creation account from the realm and the world of mythology is pointed and purposeful. It wants us to conceive of God as an uncontested God who, through the power of his word or will, creates the cosmos. And he follows that initial ordering by setting up celestial bodies, just as Marduk did. They're not in themselves, however, divinities. They are merely God's creations. In the biblical text, the firmament appears to be a beaten, the word in Hebrew is something that's been beaten out, like a metal worker would hammer out a thin sheet of metal. And that's what the firmament is. This, by the way, is the portrait of the world. It looks a lot like my map of the ancient Near East, but it's not. So you have this firmament, which is beaten back to hold back primeval waters that are pressing in. You have land, which is holding down the waters here. We inhabit the bubble that's created in that way. That's the image in Enuma Elish, and it's the image of Genesis 1. And later on, when God gets mad, he's going to open up some windows up here, right? And it's all going to, the flood. That's what's going to happen in the flood. That's the image of the world that you're working with. So the firmament is sort of like an inverted bowl, a beaten out sheet of metal that's an inverted bowl. And again, as I said, echoes of Enuma Elish, where you have Marduk dividing the carcass of Tiamat like a shellfish. He separates the waters above and the waters below and creates this space that will become the inhabited world. Okay? Now, the story of creation in Genesis 1 takes place over 7 days, and there's a certain logic and parallelism to the 6 days of creating. And I've written those parallels here. There's a parallel between day 1, day 4, day 2 and 5, day 3 and 6. On day 1, light and dark are separated. On day 4, the heavenly bodies that give off light by day or night are created. On day 2, the firmament is established. That water is separated, that bubble is opened up. So we've got sky created, and we've got the waters collected in certain areas down here, right? Water down here, and we've got sky. On day 5, the inhabitants of the skies and the waters are created, birds and fish. On day 3, land is formed to make dry spots from the waters below. So you have land being formed on day 3, it's separated out from the sea. And on day 6, you have the creation of land animals. But days 3 and 6 each have an extra element. And the fact that the first elements here pair up nicely with each other suggests that the extra element on day 3 and the extra element on day 6 might also be paired in some important way. On day 3, vegetation is created, and on day 6, humans are created after the creation of the land animals. So the implication is that the vegetation is for the humans. And indeed, it's expressly stated by God that humans are to be given every fruit-bearing tree and seed-bearing plant, fruits and grains, for food. That's in Genesis 1:29. That's what you are going to eat. There's no mention of chicken or beef. There's no mention made of animals for food. In Genesis 1, verse 30, God says that the animals are being given the green plants, the grass and herbs, for food. In other words, there should be no competition for food. Humans have fruit and grain-bearing vegetation. Animals have the herbage and the grasses. There is no excuse to live in anything but a peaceful coexistence. Therefore, humans, according to Genesis 1, were created vegetarian. And in every respect, the original creation is imagined as free of bloodshed and violence of every kind. And God saw that it was very good. So on the 7th day, God rested from his labors, and for this reason, he blessed the 7th day and declared it holy. This is a word we'll be coming back to in about 5 or 6 lectures, talking about what it is to be holy. But right now, it essentially means it belongs to God. If something's holy, it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to God. Okay? And part of the purpose of this story is to explain the origin of the observance of the Sabbath, the seventh day as a holy day. So this is a myth in that sense that it's explaining some custom or ritual among the people. So Israelite accounts of creation contain clear allusions to and resonances of ancient Near Eastern cosmogonies, but perhaps Genesis 1 can best be described as demythologizing what was a common cultural heritage. There's a clear tendency in this story towards monotheism in the abstract terms that Kaufman described, a transformation of widely known stories to express a monotheistic worldview was clearly important to these particular biblical writers, and we'll be talking later about who these writers were who wrote Genesis 1 as opposed to Genesis 2 and 3. But these stories rival and implicitly polemicize against the myths or mythologies of Israel's neighbors. They reject certain elements, but they almost reject them by incorporating them, right? They incorporate and modify them. So one of the things I've tried to claim in describing Genesis 1 is that in this story, evil is represented not as a physical reality. It's not built into the structure of the world, right? When God rests, he's looking at the whole thing. It's very good. It's set up very well. And yet we know that evil is a condition of human existence. It's a reality of life. So how do we account for it? And the Garden of Eden story, I think, seeks to answer that question. It actually does a whole bunch of things. But one thing it does, I think, is try to answer that question and to assert that evil stems from human behavior. God created a good world. But humans, in the exercise of their moral autonomy, they have the power to corrupt the good. So the Garden of Eden story communicates what Kaufman would identify as a basic idea of a monotheistic worldview, that evil isn't a metaphysical reality, it's a moral reality. What that means ultimately is that evil lacks inevitability, depending on your theory of human nature, I suppose. But it also means that evil lies within the realm of human responsibility and control. Now, Nahum Sarna, the scholar whose work I referred to earlier, he points out that there's a very important distinction between the Garden of Eden story and its ancient Near Eastern parallels. He says the motif of a tree of life or a plant of life or a plant of eternal youth, that's a motif that we do find in other ancient Near Eastern literatures, in ancient Near Eastern myth and ritual and iconography. And the quest for such a plant, or the quest for immortality, that the plant promises, that these were primary themes in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. We'll have occasion to talk in great depth about this story next time. But by contrast, Sarna says, we haven't as yet uncovered a parallel in ancient Near Eastern literature to the biblical tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not the tree of knowledge. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's a longer phrase. What is the significance of the fact that the Bible mentions both of these trees? It mentions a tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then goes on to just focus on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It virtually ignores the tree of life until we get to the end of the story, and that's important. But this tree of life, which seems to be central to many other myths of this time and this part of the world, Sarna argues that the subordinate role of the tree of life signals the biblical writer's dissociation from a preoccupation with immortality. The biblical writer insists that the central concern of life is not mortality, but morality. And the drama of human life should revolve not around the search for eternal life, but around the moral conflict and tension between a good God's design for creation and the free will of human beings that can corrupt that good design. The serpent tells Eve that if she eats the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she will become like God. And he's really not telling a lie in a certain respect. And God knows that. The human beings will become like God's knowing good and evil. It's one of the things about God, knows good and evil and has chosen the good, right? The Israelite, the biblical writer asserts of this God that he is absolutely good. The humans will become like God's knowing good and evil, not because of some magical property in this fruit. And it's not an apple, by the way. That's based on an interesting mistranslation. Do we know what the fruit is? Nobody, I don't think we really know. But it's definitely not an apple. That comes from the Latin word, which sounds like apple. The word malum for evil is close to the Latin word for apple, which if anybody knows. whatever. And so for the history, iconography began to represent this tree as an apple tree and so on. But it's not an apple tree. I don't know if they had apple trees back then there. But it's not because of some magical property in the fruit itself, but because of the action of disobedience itself. By choosing to eat of the fruit in defiance of God, right? This is the one thing God says, don't do this. You can have everything else in this garden. Presumably, even you can eat of the tree of life, right? Doesn't say you can't eat of that. Who's to say they couldn't eat of that and just live forever? Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Is there any sort of explanation for why God says you can't eat of this tree when he's given all of the fruit-bearing trees?
There have been about how many thousands of years of speculation on what's going on, and you're going to be reading a wonderful and interesting Gnostic interpretation. So, yep, there's been lots of interesting, and this is all in the realm of literary interpretation. Read the story closely. See if you can figure out what's going on here. Why does God do this? Why, isn't this in a way putting an obstacle in front of someone, almost ensuring they're going to trip over it? That's been an argument that some commentators have made. Others see it differently. So keep that thought, take it to section, and read Elaine Pagel's work and some of the other interpretations. That's something people have struggled with for centuries. Right? Where does this come from? Who's this serpent? What's he doing there? They're all very important. It is true, and maybe this will go a little bit of the distance towards answering it. It's by eating of the fruit in defiance of God, human beings learn that they were able to do that they are free moral agents. They find that out. They're able to choose their actions in conformity with God's will or in defiance of God's will. So paradoxically, they learn that they have moral autonomy. Remember, they were made in the image of God, and they learn that they have moral autonomy by making the defiant choice, right? The choice for disobedience. The argument could be made that until they once disobeyed, how would they ever know that? And then you might raise all sorts of questions about, well, was this part of God's plan that they ought to know this and should know this so that their choice for good actually becomes meaningful? Is it meaningful to choose to do the good when you have no choice to do otherwise or aren't aware that you have a choice to do otherwise? So there's a wonderful 13th century commentator that says that God needed creatures who could choose to obey him. And therefore, it was important for Adam and Eve to do what they did and to learn that they have the choice not to obey God so that their choice for God would become endowed with meaning. That's one line of interpretation that's gone through many theological systems for hundreds of years. So the very action that brought them a godlike awareness of their moral autonomy was an action that was taken in opposition to God. So we see then that having knowledge of good and evil is no guarantee that one will choose or incline towards the good. That's what the serpent omitted in his speech. Right? He said, if you eat of that fruit, of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll become like God. It's true in one sense, but it's false in another. He's sort of omitted to point out. He implies that it's the power of moral choice alone that is God-like. But the biblical writer will claim in many places that true godliness isn't simply power, the power to do what one wishes. True godliness means imitation of God, the exercise of one's power in a manner that is God-like, good, life-affirming, and so on. So it's the biblical writer's contention that the God of Israel is not only all-powerful, but is essentially and necessarily good. Those two elements cannot become disjoined. They must always be conjoined in the biblical writer's view. And finally, humans will learn that the concomitant of their freedom is responsibility. Their first act of defiance is punished harshly. So they learn in this story that the moral choices and actions of humans have consequences that have to be borne by the perpetrator. So just to sum up, Sarna sees in the Garden of Eden story, as I've just explained it, a message that's in line with Kaufman's thesis about the monotheistic worldview. He says, the story conveys the idea that, quote, evil is a product of human behavior, not a principle inherent in the cosmos. Man's disobedience is the cause of the human predicament. Human freedom can be at one and the same time an omen of disaster and a challenge and opportunity. We've looked at Genesis 2 and 3 a little bit as an attempt to account for the problematic and paradoxical existence of evil and suffering in a world created by a good God. And that's a problem monotheism really never completely conquers. But other perspectives on this story are possible. And when we come back on Monday, we're going to look at it from an entirely different point of view and compare it with the Epic of Gilgamesh. So last time I gave a reading of the creation accounts that are in Genesis 1 to 3. These are two very different stories, but their placement side by side suggests the possibility of a joint reading. Nevertheless, they are very different in character. And today I want to focus in on the second creation story. This is the story that is predominantly in Genesis 2 and trickles into Genesis 3. And I'm going to look at it mostly in isolation from the first account. I'm going to be looking at it in light of an important parallel. This parallel is the Epic of Gilgamesh. I get to point this way now to the boards, okay? The Epic of Gilgamesh. And I'll be drawing on the work of many scholars, Nahum Sarna probably most prominently among them, but others also who have devoted themselves to the study of these textual parallels and developing an interpretation of these stories. I'd like you to carry that with you into your discussion sections as you look at some of the other interpretations from antiquity and on into the modern period. Now, the Epic of Gilgamesh is a magnificent Mesopotamian epic that relates the exploits of a Sumerian king, King Gilgamesh of Uruk. That's the name of the city-state over which he is king. And the epic as we now have it was probably composed between 2000 and 1800 BCE. Gilgamesh was apparently a historical character, an actual king of Uruk, but the story, of course, has fantastic and legendary qualities to it. We have a full text of the epic that was located in the library of Ashurbanipal, an Assyrian king. It's a 7th century copy of the story. But we have fragments that are much, much older, that date back to the 18th century, that were found in Iraq. So clearly it's an old story, and we have even older prototypes for elements of the story as well. The story opens with a description of Gilgamesh. He's an extremely unpopular king. He's tyrannical, he's rapacious, he's undisciplined, he's oversexed. The people in the city cry out to the gods. They want relief from him. They particularly cite his abuses towards the young women of the city. And the god Aruru is told that she must deal with Gilgamesh. Aruru is on the board. So Aruru fashions this noble savage named Enkidu. Enkidu is designed to be a match for Gilgamesh, and he's very much like the biblical human in Genesis 2. He's sort of an innocent, primitive. He appears unclothed. He lives a free, peaceful life in harmony with the animals, with nature and the beasts. He races across the steppes with the gazelles. But before he can enter the city and meet Gilgamesh, he has to be tamed. So a woman is sent to Enkidu, and her job is to provide the sexual initiation that will tame and civilize Enkidu. I'm reading now from the Epic of Gilgamesh. For 6 days and 7 nights, Enkidu comes forth mating with the lass. After he had had his fill of her charms, he set his face toward his wild beasts. On seeing him, Enkidu, the gazelles ran off. The wild beasts of the steppe drew away from his body. Startled was Enkidu as his body became taut. His knees were motionless, for the wild beasts had gone. Enkidu had to slacken his pace. It was not as before. But he now had wisdom, broader understanding. Returning, he sits at the feet of the harlot. I'm not sure why that translation. I've been told by those who know Akkadian that the word could mean harlot, prostitute. It could mean some sacred prostitute. I'm not an expert in Akkadian. But he looks up at the face of the harlot, his ears attentive as the harlot speaks. And the harlot says to him, to Enkidu, "Thou art wise, Enkidu. You art become like a god. Why with the wild creatures dost thou roam over the steppe? Come, let me lead thee to ramparted Uruk, to the holy temple, abode of Anu and Ishtar, where lives Gilgamesh, accomplished in strength, and like a wild ox lords it over the folk." As she speaks to him, her words find favor. His heart enlightened, he yearns for a friend. Enkidu says to her, to the harlot, "Up, lass, escort me to Gilgamesh. I will challenge him and will boldly address him." So that's tablet 1 from the Epic of Gilgamesh. So through this sexual experience, Enkidu has become wise, growing in mental and spiritual stature, and he is said to have become like a god. At the same time, there's been a concomitant loss of innocence. His harmonious unity with nature is broken. He clothes himself, and his old friends, the gazelles, run from him now. He will never again roam free with the animals. He cannot run as quickly. His pace slackens. He can't even keep up with them. So as one reads the epic, one senses this very deep ambivalence regarding the relative virtues and evils of civilized life and many of the features that make us human. On the one hand, it's clearly good that humans rise above the animals and build cities and wear clothes and pursue the arts of civilization and develop bonds of love and duty and friendship, the way that animals do not. These are the things that make humans like the gods in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But on the other hand, these advances have also come at a cost. And in this story, there's also a sense of longing for the freedom of life in the wild, the innocent, simple, uncomplicated life lived day to day without plans, without toil, in harmony with nature, a somewhat Edenic existence. So there are very obvious parallels between this part of the epic that I've just read to you and our second creation story. Enkidu, like Adam, is fashioned from clay. He's a noble savage, he's a kind of innocent primitive, and he lives in a peaceful coexistence with animals. Nature yields its fruits to him without hard labor. He's unaware of, he's unattracted by the benefits of civilization, clothing, cities, and all their labor. Just as Enkidu gains wisdom and becomes like a god and loses his oneness with nature, so Adam and Eve, after eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, are said to have become like gods, and they also lose their harmonious relationship with nature. In Genesis 3:15, God says to the snake, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. They shall strike at your head, and you shall strike at their heels." Presumably, there had been a peaceful relationship between creatures like snakes and humans to that point. They're banished now from the garden. It used to yield their fruits to them without any labor, but now humans have to toil for food, and the earth yields its fruits only stintingly. So in Genesis 3:18, God says to Adam, "Cursed be the ground because of you. By toil shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it sprout for you, but your food shall be the grasses of the field. By the sweat of your brow shall you give bread to eat." So knowledge or wisdom or perhaps moral freedom seem to come at a very high price. But there are important differences between these stories too. And the most important has to do with the nature of the act that leads to the transformation of the human characters. It's Enkidu's sexual experience, his 7-day encounter with the woman, that makes him wise and godlike at the cost of his life with the beasts. There has been a long tradition of interpreting the deed or the sin of Adam and Eve as sexual. And there are some hints in the story that would support such an interpretation. And I was just reading recently a scholarly introduction to Genesis that very much argues and develops this interpretation. Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in violation of God's command. Now, eating can perhaps be a metaphor for sex, some have argued. Knowledge of good and evil, perhaps that could be understood in sexual terms. In biblical Hebrew, the word to know can mean to know in the biblical sense. It can mean sexual intercourse. Snakes are symbols of renewed life and fertility in the East because they shed their skins, so they seem to be eternally young. And they're also phallic symbols. Eve says that the snake seduced her and uses a term that has some sexual overtones. So do all of these hints suggest that in the biblical view, the change in Adam and Eve came about through sex? If so, is sex a negative thing forbidden by God? It would depend if you view the change as a negative thing. That seems unlikely in my view. You will certainly hear it argued, but it seems unlikely in my view. God's first command to the first couple was to be fruitful and multiply. Now, admittedly, that comes from the first creation story in Genesis 1. Nevertheless, in the second creation story, when the writer is recounting the creation of woman, the writer refers to the fact that man and woman will become one flesh. So it seems that sex was part of the plan for humans even at creation. Also, it's only after their defiance of God's command that Adam and Eve first become aware of and ashamed by their nakedness, putting the sort of sexual awakening after the act of disobedience rather than at the same time or prior to. So maybe what we have here is another polemic, another adaptation of familiar stories and motifs to express something new. Perhaps for the biblical writer, Adam and Eve's transformation occurs after an act of disobedience, not after a 7-day sexual encounter. The disobedience happens in a rather backhanded way. It's kind of interesting. God tells Adam before the creation of Eve that he's not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's in Genesis 2:16, on pain of death. Eve doesn't hear this command directly. She has not yet been created. In Genesis 3, we meet the cunning serpent, and although many later Hellenistic Jewish texts and the New Testament will identify the snake as a satan, an enticer, a tempter, some sort of evil creature, he doesn't seem to be so in this fable. There's no real devil or satan character, we'll talk about Job later, in the Hebrew Bible. The snake in Eden is simply a talking animal. He's a standard literary device that you see in fables of this period and later, the kind that you find, for example, in the fables of Aesop. And the woman responds to the serpent's queries by saying that eating and even touching the tree is forbidden on pain of death. One wonders whence the addition of touching. Did Adam convey God's command to Eve with an emphasis all his own? Don't even touch that tree, Eve. It's curtains for us if you do. She didn't hear the original command. Or did she just mishear in some very tragic version of the telephone game, you know? And the serpent tells her, no, you're not going to die if you touch or eat the fruit. In fact, he adds, the fruit will bring you wisdom, making humans like gods who know good and bad. And in fact, that's certainly true. He tells her the truth. Genesis 3:7 is a very critical verse, and it's rarely properly translated. Most translations read like this: she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband, and he ate. The implication is that Eve acts alone, and then she goes and finds Adam and gives him some of the apple and convinces him to eat it. But in fact, the Hebrew literally reads, she took of its fruit and ate, and gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. With her is a very teeny tiny little word in Hebrew, so I guess a lot of translations figure they can leave it out. But the with her is there in the Hebrew. At that fateful moment, Adam and Eve are standing together at the tree. And although only the woman and the serpent speak, Adam was present, and it seems he accepted the fruit that his wife handed him. He was fully complicitous, and indeed God holds him responsible. He reproaches Adam. Adam says, well, Eve handed it to me. She gave it to me. Eve explains the serpent tricked me. God vents his fury on all three, and he does so in ascending order. First the snake for his trickery, and then the woman, and finally the man. So just as the harlot tells Enkidu after his sexual awakening that he has become like a god, so Adam and Eve, after eating the forbidden fruit, are said to be like divine beings. Why? Perhaps because they have become wise in that they have learned they have moral choice. They have free will. They can defy God and God's plans for them in a way that animals and natural phenomena cannot. But now that means there is a serious danger here. And in Genesis 3, verse 22, God says, now that man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, what if he should stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever? So it's the threat of an immortal antagonist that is so disturbing and must be avoided. And so God banishes Adam and Eve from the garden, and he stations these kruvim, these cherubim, not puffy, cute little babies like Raphael painted, but these fierce, monstrous creatures, and a fiery, ever-turning sword to guard the way back to the tree of life. It is now inaccessible. So the acceptance of mortality as an inescapable part of the human condition, it's a part of this story. It's also one of the themes of the Epic of Gilgamesh. As the story continues, Enkidu enters the city, and Enkidu earns Gilgamesh's respect and deep love. And this is the first time that this rapacious tyrant has ever actually loved anyone, and his character is reformed as a result. And then the rest of the epic contains the adventures of these two close friends, all of the things that they do together. And when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is absolutely devastated. He's for the first time confronted with his own mortality. He's obsessed with grief over Enkidu, and he's obsessed with the whole issue of mortality. He begins a quest for immortality, and that takes up most of the rest of the epic. He leaves the city, he travels far and wide, he crosses these primeval seas and endures all sorts of hardships, and finally, exhausted and battered, he reaches Utnapishtim, also there on the board, Utnapishtim, who is the only mortal ever to have been granted immortality by the gods. And he comes to him and asks for his secret. It turns out that Utnapishtim can't help him. And we'll come back to Utnapishtim later in the flood story. And Gilgamesh is devastated. He then learns the whereabouts of a plant of eternal youth. And he says, well, that's better than nothing. That at least will keep him young. And so he goes after the plant of eternal youth, but he's negligent for a moment, and a thieving snake or serpent manages to steal it, and that explains why snakes are always shedding their skins and are forever young. Gilgamesh is exhausted, he feels defeated, he returns to Uruk, and as he stands looking at the city from a distance, gazing at it, he takes comfort in the thought that although humans are finite and frail and doomed to die, their accomplishments and their great works give them some foothold in human memory. Now, Nachum Sarna is one of the people who's pointed out that the quest for immortality, which is so central in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is really deflected in the biblical story. The tree of life is mentioned, and it's mentioned with a definite article. Genesis 2:9 says, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden, as if this is a motif we're familiar with, as if this is something we all know about. But then it's really not mentioned again as the story proceeds. The snake, which in the Epic of Gilgamesh is associated with the plant of eternal youth, in Genesis is associated instead with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's the focus of our attention in Genesis. And it's only at the end of the story that the tree of life appears again in the passage that is emphasizing its permanent inaccessibility. And we could perhaps draw two conclusions from this. First, it may be that Adam and Eve had access to this tree up to that point. As long as their will conformed to the will of God, there was no danger to them going on eternally, being immortal. Once they discovered their moral freedom, once they discovered that they could thwart God and work evil in the world, and abuse and corrupt all that God had created, then God could not afford to allow them access to the tree of life. That would be tantamount to creating divine enemies, immortal enemies. So God must maintain the upper hand in his struggle with these humans who have learned to defy him. He maintains the upper hand in this, the fact that they eventually must die. Second of all, the motif of guards who block access to the tree of life suggests that no humans have access to immortality, and the pursuit of immortality is futile. So it might be then that God really spoke the truth after all. The fruit did bring death to humankind. Before we leave this story and move on to Cain and Abel, I just want to make a couple of quick observations. First of all, the opening chapters of Genesis, Genesis 1 through 3, have been subjected to centuries of theological interpretation, and I hope that you're in the midst of reading some of them now. They have generated, for example, the doctrine of original sin, which is the idea that humans, after Adam, are born into a state of sin, by definition. As many ancient interpreters already have observed, the actions of Adam and Eve bring death to the human race. They don't bring a state of utter and unredeemed sinfulness. In fact, what they tell us is that humans have moral choice in each and every age. The story is primarily ideological rather than prescriptive or normative. We've talked about this word, ideological tales that are trying to explain how or why something is the way it is. This is why serpents shed their skin, for example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh. They were the ones who got the plant of eternal youth. It's ideological. The writer observes that humans emerge from innocent childhood to self-conscious adulthood. The writer observes that survival is a difficult endeavor and that the world can sometimes seem harshly hostile. The writer observes that women are desirous of and emotionally bonded to the very persons who establish the conditions of their subordination. The story is explaining how these odd conditions of life came to be as they are. which is not to say that it's the ideal situation or even that it's God's will for humankind. These are ideological fables, and they're best read as such. Second of all, in this story, we see something that we'll see repeatedly in the Pentateuch. And that is that God has to punt a bit. He has to modify his plans for the first couple by barring access to the tree of life. That was not something presumably he planned to do. This is in response to, perhaps, their unforeseen disobedience. Certainly, the way the story unfolds, it's how it seems to us. So, despite their newfound mortality, humans are going to be a force to be reckoned with. They're unpredictable to the very God who created them.